The dead fish surfaced first, silent, silver bodies drifting toward my dock as the sunrise painted the lake in muted gold. I knew instantly something was wrong. And when the chemical smell hit the air, sharp and unnatural, I realized someone had poisoned the water, and the only person angry enough to do it was Karen. Before I explain how her sabotage nearly poisoned the entire community, stay with me till the end. The lake behind my house wasn't just water, it was part of my daily rhythm, part of the community's lifeline, and for me, a quiet place where early mornings felt peaceful. I had been fishing there for years, long before the HOA formed, long before rules tightened, and long before Karen arrived with her clipboard and her self-declared mission to fix the neighborhood. The water was calm, framed by tall reeds and willow trees that swayed softly with the slightest breeze. Every morning, a faint mist hovered just above the surface, and the smell of damp earth mixed with cool air was enough to reset the mind. But over the past few months, Karen had taken issue with everything. My fishing schedule, the presence of my small lakeside shed, even the tin bucket I kept for bait. She claimed it was visual pollution, as if a simple metal bucket threatened the entire community's aesthetic. Her complaints escalated weekly. Sometimes I saw her from the corner of my eye, standing stiffly beside the lake path, watching me cast my line as though I were committing a crime. Her disapproval wasn't about rules, it was about control. And the lake, for reasons known only to her, seemed to be the center of her resentment. The tension reached a peak when she barged onto my dock one afternoon, demanding I stop fishing altogether. She claimed the lake was for viewing only, not for recreational exploitation. I calmly reminded her that the HOA didn't own the water. The county did. And fishing was not only legal, it was encouraged under environmental guidelines to maintain balance. That answer didn't just frustrate her. It shattered her illusion of authority. She stormed away, muttering about taking action. At the time, I chalked it up to another outburst. I didn't realize those words were a warning of something darker. 2 mornings later, something immediately felt off as I approached the dock. The usual clean scent of fresh water had been replaced by a chemical tang, sharp, synthetic, unmistakably foreign. A thin foam floated near the reeds and the water's surface seemed duller, almost bruised in color. Then I saw the first fish, floating sideways near the dock, gills pale, eyes clouded. Another drifted toward the shore. And another. A coldness spread through my chest. Fish don't die in clusters unless something catastrophic has happened. I knelt down, touched the water, and the faint sting on my skin confirmed my fear: contamination. My heart pounded as the evidence accumulated around me. Dead minnows tangled in the reeds. A large base washed onto the shallow rocks. Frogs that usually clung to the dock pilings were nowhere in sight. Even the birds seemed quieter, hesitant. This wasn't natural, it was deliberate. And in that heavy silence, one image flashed through my mind. Karen standing near the lake 2 nights earlier, holding something in her hand, a large, unlabeled jug. I had noticed her because she wasn't walking her dog as usual. She was crouched near the shoreline, pouring something into the water with quick, secretive motions. At the time, I thought she was maybe watering plants or cleaning something. I didn't question it. But now, with the water carrying a chemical burn and fish floating lifeless, that memory sharpened painfully. A chill crawled across my spine. Had she really done something so reckless? Poisoning a lake wasn't simply neighborhood mischief, it was a crime. And worse, our lake wasn't just decorative. It wasn't just for fishing. It was connected to the underground channels that fed into the community's secondary water system, the one used for irrigation, emergency reserves, and filtration trials. Most residents didn't even know how interconnected the lake was with the infrastructure beneath the ground. But I had attended enough council meetings to understand its importance. Contaminating the lake meant contaminating every lawn irrigation system, every garden hose, every maintenance reservoir the HOA relied on. It meant risking the water that nourished the community's shared green spaces. It meant threatening the ecosystem built over decades. And all because Karen wanted to stop one person from fishing. The weight of that realization settled heavily on me. This wasn't personal anymore. This was dangerous. I grabbed my phone immediately and began taking pictures of the fish, the foam, the discolored water, the unnatural sheen drifting near the shoreline. Documentation was the only way to prevent denial later. As I moved along the path, the damage became more evident. Water insects floated lifeless. The once clear shallows now looked clouded with a faint oily ripple. Even the cattails seemed to droop unnaturally. Something toxic had entered the lake and it was spreading. The urgency in my chest tightened with every step. This was no minor incident. This was a threat to everyone's health. Just as I reached the footbridge, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, heavy, hesitant. I turned. Karen stood there, arms crossed, eyes hardened, pretending she saw nothing unusual. But her gaze flicked nervously toward the dead fish clustered near the rocks. There was a faint tremor in her breathing, an awareness she couldn't hide. The smell of chemicals still lingered in the air. Her expression said denial. Her posture said guilt. And the silence between us grew thick, pressing against the morning air like a storm waiting to break. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it quickly. I stared at the water, at the spreading discoloration, at the lake that had sustained this community for decades. The truth pulsed in my mind with sharp clarity. Karen had crossed a line so severe she didn't even understand the consequences yet. This wasn't about fishing anymore. This wasn't even about HOA authority. This was environmental damage to a community resource. Damage that could no longer be hidden, ignored, or brushed aside by her usual arrogance. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the poisoned shoreline, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This incident was about to explode far beyond her control. The next morning, when I pushed open the wooden gate leading down to the lake, the familiar landscape felt foreign. A thin, milky film floated across the surface, catching the early light in an unnatural sheen. The air smelled sharp, chemical, bitter, the kind that stings the back of the throat on the first inhale. I stepped onto the dock and the boards groaned softly under my weight. Everywhere I looked, dead fish drifted aimlessly, pale bellies catching the sunlight like tiny mirrors. The scene felt wrong, heavy, as though the lake itself was trying to warn me of what had happened. I pulled out my phone and began taking photos from every angle. Dead minnows tangled in reeds, mid-sized bass floating near the rocks, and dozens of small silver bodies drifting across the still surface. Documentation was the only thing that could protect the truth later. I moved slowly along the dock, the wood damp beneath my boots, the faint smell of rot beginning to rise from the water's edge. Every picture captured another detail, another sign. That the lake hadn't changed naturally. Something foreign had entered it, something intentional. And the weight of that realization pressed harder with every step I took. At the far edge of the shoreline, I noticed the soil looked darker, unnaturally saturated. Kneeling down, I saw it wasn't moisture. It was a slick, shimmering residue embedded into the mud. It glinted under the sun with a faint oily rainbow. This was the exact spot where I saw Karen crouch 2 nights earlier, pouring something from a large plastic jug into the water. At the time, the moment seemed harmless, forgettable, a neighbor doing whatever neighbors do near water. But now, in the wake of this destruction, that memory clicked sharply into place. This wasn't coincidence. It was cause. I began photographing the soil, the strange sheen, the discoloration. Then I filled a clean sample vial with lake water. A faint burn tingled across my fingertips as the water splashed lightly across my skin, proof that whatever had been introduced wasn't safe. As I capped the sample, a thought hit me with cold clarity. The lake wasn't just an isolated body of water. It was connected, deep underneath, to a network of irrigation channels that fed lawns, gardens, and community green spaces. Poisoning this lake wasn't just harming the fish. It was threatening the ecosystem, and potentially the health, of every household nearby. I rushed back inside, heart pounding, and immediately contacted the county's water authority and environmental response line. My voice stayed calm as I gave them everything. The location, the unnatural smell, the dead wildlife, the visual evidence. Possible contamination, I said. Possibly chemical. They took it seriously. After I hung up, the house felt unnervingly quiet, as though the walls themselves were listening. Outside, through the window, the lake shimmered with a dull, lifeless film. The situation was now bigger than me, bigger than fishing, bigger than HOA disputes. This was now an environmental threat. Within an hour, 2 white trucks rolled up beside the lake. Officials in protective gloves and boots stepped out carrying sample kits, testing meters, and sealed containers. They moved with quiet precision, surveying the scene like investigators walking onto a crime site. I stayed back to give them room, offering documentation only when asked. Their expressions tightened as they checked the water, lifted dead fish, and measured chemical levels. The numbers on their meters flashed red far too quickly. They didn't say much, but they didn't need to. Their silence carried a steady message. This wasn't natural, it wasn't accidental. They collected samples from multiple points: surface water, deeper pockets, shoreline sediment, even from flowing channels that connected the lake to the community irrigation system. One of the specialists knelt near the water's edge, holding a vial up to the sunlight. The way the liquid refracted, a cloudy, unnatural yellow, made his jaw tighten. Another official typed readings into a handheld device, his eyebrows lowering as the values rose. They didn't reveal their findings to me, but their body language said everything. My suspicion was no longer just an assumption. Something toxic had entered the lake and it threatened to spread further. Later that afternoon, one of the trucks left for the main pumping station located a short distance from the lake. I watched from across the yard as they carried folders inside, folders containing the same images and data I had provided moments earlier. The pumping station was a critical junction. If contamination reached it, it could infiltrate sprinklers, community gardens, and backup water reserves. The officials' immediate attention to it confirmed my worst fear. The poison wasn't sitting idly at the surface, it was moving. And if they didn't stop it in time, the consequences would ripple far wider than dead fish. As the day softened into late afternoon, more vehicles arrived, this time stopping at the HOA clubhouse. A mix of board members and two unfamiliar officials entered, carrying clipboards and digital tablets. Tension radiated from the building like heat. Moments later, Karen appeared at the far end of the sidewalk, walking faster than usual, face tight, shoulders rigid. She avoided looking at the water entirely. She stepped into the clubhouse with a hurried breath, closing the door behind her. Whatever had begun at the lake that morning had now reached the administrative heart of the community. From outside, I could only see the shadows through the clubhouse blinds. Gestures, pacing, papers exchanged hands. The conversation inside grew tense. Sharp movements, stiff posture, silent arguments visible only in their silhouettes. Meanwhile, the lake behind me remained still and poisoned, the smell of chemicals lingering in the air like an unspoken accusation. The truth had grown too large to contain. This wasn't about fishing privileges anymore. It was about contamination, negligence, and the risk of poisoning an entire community. And as I stood there watching the sun lower across the damaged shoreline, I realized, the fallout had only just begun. By the next morning the lake looked worse. Overnight winds had pushed a larger mass of dead fish toward the shallow end, forming a pale, motionless cluster that stretched several feet along the bank. The chemical sheen spread wider too, catching the early sunlight in harsh streaks of yellow and silver. The air carried a bitter, acrid odor that clung to everything, clothes, hair, even the wooden planks of the dock. I walked slowly along the edge, boots sinking into damp soil, each step echoing the same thought. This wasn't just contamination. This was a full-scale environmental event unfolding in real time. The environmental team arrived again just after sunrise. This time they brought a larger crew, more equipment, more protective gear, more sampling kits. Their faces were serious, movements quick and purposeful. They didn't need to confirm anything verbally, their increased presence said enough. I watched as they marked sections of the shoreline with yellow flags, took deeper core samples from the sediment, and launched a small drone to map the spread pattern of the toxins. Every action had urgency behind it. Whatever chemical had been dumped, whatever Karen poured into the water that night, was strong, spreading, and unmistakably harmful. One of the officials approached me with a clipboard, asking to review my photographs and timeline once more. His tone was respectful but sharp, the kind used when trying to reconstruct exact sequencing in an investigation. I walked him through everything, the moment I noticed the smell, the first dead fish, the exact location of the residue on the soil. When he asked if I'd seen anything unusual in the days prior, the image of Karen crouching by the water surfaced instantly. I explained what I had witnessed. He scribbled rapidly, his expression tightening as if the puzzle pieces had just snapped together. After noting my statement, he excused himself and joined two others near the bridge. They spoke quietly, but their gestures were not subtle. One pointed toward the exact area where I'd seen Karen. Another nodded, then tapped something into a tablet. They weren't treating this as neighborhood drama. They were treating it as contamination with a known suspect, a possible criminal act. And with each step they took, the evidence seemed to align grimly in the same direction. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the metallic odor through the reeds. Even the birds had abandoned the area, leaving an eerie silence behind. By midday, the HOA had fully realized the severity of the situation. Several board members hurried toward the lake, trying to appear composed but failing miserably. Their eyes darted between the environmental officials, the poisoned water, and the growing cluster of yellow flags marking trouble spots. Not long after, Karen emerged from her house. Her usual rigid confidence was nowhere to be found. Her steps were slower, her shoulders hunched. She paused at the edge of her porch, staring at the officials with a mixture of confusion and dread. For the first time, she looked like someone facing consequences she hadn't imagined. Eventually, two environmental officers walked toward the HOA clubhouse, files in hand. Karen followed reluctantly, her movements stiff, like someone being pulled by an unseen force. I watched from a distance as they entered, the clubhouse door shutting behind them with a soft but heavy finality. Inside, the blinds shifted slightly, revealing tense silhouettes. Hands gestured sharply, paperwork exchanged, someone pacing. The atmosphere was thick with confrontation. Karen's body language in the shadows told enough, defensive, cornered, her gestures growing small compared to the stern posture of the officials questioning her. The quiet dominance she once flaunted had evaporated completely. As the meeting continued inside, the environmental crew outside expanded their perimeter. They placed warning signs along the walking path, set up small temporary barriers near the dock, and tested irrigation valves that connected the lake to the community watering system. The sight made my stomach sink. If even a portion of that contaminated water had entered the irrigation network, lawns, community parks, and even private garden lines could be carrying traces of poison. The scale of what Karen had done was becoming clearer by the hour. She hadn't just tried to stop me from fishing, she had threatened an entire ecosystem. By late afternoon, the officials inside the clubhouse emerged, stone-faced, purposeful. Karen followed several steps behind, eyes fixed on the ground, arms wrapped tightly around herself as though bracing against a cold wind. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She walked straight to her home, disappearing behind her door with a swiftness that revealed more than any confession could. Whatever the officials had told her, it had hit hard. As they walked past me, one nodded politely, but his expression was grim. This wasn't the end of the investigation. This was only the beginning of accountability. An hour later, a formal notice appeared in every resident's mailbox. The letter warned of a potential chemical contamination in the lake and urged residents to avoid the water and all irrigation-connected areas until further notice. It mentioned a human-caused event under investigation. Though they didn't name Karen, the omission fooled no one. Neighbors read the notice with wide eyes and whispered disbelief. Some glanced toward her house. Others walked to the lake's edge, stopping short when they saw the floating fish. Real fear began replacing the irritation that HOA politics once caused. Now the community understood the magnitude. As evening settled in, the sky turning a dull amber, I stood on my dock looking across the damaged water. The once lively lake, filled with ripples, birds and the soft rustling of reeds, now felt hollow, its silence heavy with consequence. The chemical smell hung low, stirring faintly with each shift of the wind. I knew the next steps would not be small. Reports were being filed, tests being processed, and officials preparing their findings. Karen had set something in motion she could no longer stop. And as the last light disappeared behind the trees, one truth settled deeply within me. Justice was moving. The final wave of consequences began early the next morning, carried not by rumor or emotion, but by the calm certainty of official procedure. 2 county vehicles rolled quietly into the neighborhood just after sunrise. Behind them, a marked environmental enforcement unit followed, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. Neighbors stepped out onto porches, pretending to check the weather while their eyes traced every movement. The lake lay still behind the houses, a silent reminder of the damage already done. The air felt cold, heavier than usual, as though waiting for the moment when the last piece of the truth would fall into place. I watched from a distance as the officers walked toward the HOA clubhouse with folders under their arms, thick, official, final. Their expressions held no hesitation. Whatever test they had run overnight had given them the clarity they needed. As they stepped inside, the door closed behind them with a quiet firmness. Within minutes, another figure appeared on the sidewalk, Karen. She exited her house slowly, moving with a stiffness that revealed how little sleep she had gotten. There was no clipboard in her hand today, no air of superiority in her stride. She looked smaller, like someone carrying a weight she never expected to bear. Inside the clubhouse, silhouettes cast shifting patterns against the blinds. The officer sat across from the HOA board while Karen stood a few feet away, her posture tense and uncertain. Though I couldn't hear a single word, the rhythm of the conversation was visible. An officer explaining calmly, a board member leaning forward defensively, another sinking back in disbelief. Karen's hands moved occasionally, small gestures of denial or confusion, but each time she tried to speak, the officials interrupted with the unwavering steadiness of documented evidence. The truth was no longer a matter of opinion. It was recorded, measured, undeniable. After nearly an hour, the clubhouse door opened. The officer stepped outside first, followed by the HOA board, whose faces carried the stunned rigidity of people forced to confront a failure within their own system. Then Karen emerged. Her eyes were red, not from tears of sympathy, but from the collision of pride and consequence. She didn't storm away or argue or search the street for someone to blame. She simply stood there for a moment, staring at the ground, as though the weight of everything she had done had finally settled onto her shoulders in full, unavoidable clarity. Later that afternoon, an official notice was distributed to every home, this time not just from the HOA but from the County Environmental Enforcement Division. The message was blunt, factual, and free of soft language. It stated that the lake had been contaminated with a harmful chemical introduced by an unauthorized civilian action, resulting in ecological damage, public safety risk, and emergency intervention. It also announced temporary water restrictions and upcoming remedial treatment phases. The neighborhood buzzed with shock. People gathered in small circles, reading and rereading the letter, realizing the gravity of what had nearly happened to all of them. Not long after, another message arrived, this one from the HOA itself. And unlike their usual controlled tone, this one carried an edge of surrender. They confirmed Karen's immediate removal from all HOA responsibilities pending further legal review. They apologized for oversight failure and the community risk created under their watch. For years they had enabled her behavior, her self-imposed authority, her personal crusades, her misguided enforcement. Now, with the lake poisoned and the truth exposed, they could no longer shield her. The system she hid behind had finally stepped away, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Throughout the afternoon, neighbors approached me one by one, not out of gossip but out of genuine concern and gratitude. Some apologized for staying silent when Karen first escalated her hostility. Others admitted they never believed her behavior could go this far. A few shook their heads in disbelief, staring at the lake as if seeing it for the first time. The poisoned water had become a symbol, not just of harm but of the fragile balance in any community. When one person misuses power, the effects ripple outward. But when the truth surfaces, it has a way of restoring that balance. The environmental restoration team returned in the evening with pumps and aerators. The machines hummed steadily as they worked to oxygenate the water and filter out toxins, sending gentle ripples across the lake's surface. For the first time in days, the water stirred with a sense of healing. The sun set behind the trees, casting long gold reflections across the recovering shoreline. The scene felt symbolic, damage slowly giving way to recovery, silence transforming into movement. Standing there, I realized the lake would eventually heal, the wildlife would return, and the ecosystem would stabilize. But what happened would not soon be forgotten. Just as the sky faded into deep blue, I saw Karen step quietly onto her porch. She looked out toward the lake, her face hollow with a mixture of regret and disbelief. For the first time she seemed aware of the magnitude of what she had done, not just to me, not just to the HOA, but to every family who relied on this water system. She didn't speak. She didn't move toward anyone. She simply stood there, facing the silent evidence of her actions. It wasn't humiliation that surrounded her, it was consequence. A consequence she had built with her own hands. As night settled and the machines continued their steady hum, I stood at the end of my dock and watched the water shifting under the moonlight. It would take time for the lake to return to what it once was, but the truth had already done its work. It had exposed recklessness, corrected a long-standing imbalance, and proven that control built on pride collapses when confronted by reality. Karen tried to poison my peace, but she ended up poisoning the very system that sustained her own community. And standing there in the quiet night, one final truth echoed clearly: karma doesn't need permission, it only needs timing.